Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you every single step I took to make this scene. It was inspired by the water animation in Spirited Away, which caught my eye a lot while I was watching it. So I decided to make a project based on it, but obviously a little bit different. By the end of this video, you'll have a great understanding of making stylized water animations for scenes like this. I'll go slower and explain more stuff in the beginning, and as the video progresses, we'll pick up the pace a little bit. Let's get into it. So the first thing that we want to do is hit Shift A and add a plane. What we're going to do here is we're basically going to make the waterfall itself. If you go into edit mode and you basically drag up the top edge, what you could do is then use Control R to add a bunch of loop cuts. And basically from there, you want to just use proportional editing to shape this, I guess like curve you could say, into a sort of falling waterfall shape. You can see what I'm doing here, and I hope you guys can understand. But yeah, that's pretty much all of the modeling that we have to do for now. Now let's make the texture. The next thing you want to do is you want to go into rendered view and basically add a new material. What we're going to do first is we're going to add a gradient texture, and the reason why is because we basically want to have these cascading sheets that fall on top of each other for the waterfall. The way I added those mapping and texture coordinate nodes automatically was by hitting Control T with the gradient texture selected. The mapping node is straightforward, but for the texture coordinate node, let's focus on understanding the generated object and UV options. With the generated option on the texture coordinate node, the gradient texture will stay in place when you move it around in edit mode and then switch back to object mode. The object option on the texture coordinate node, on the other hand, will base the texture on wherever the origin point of the model is. The origin point is this orange dot, and so wherever that orange dot is where the gradient texture will originate from. Lastly, the UV option will make the gradient texture originate based on the UV unwrap of the model. As you can see, for this completely flat plane, it's pretty straightforward, and as I move around or scale the unwrap in the UV editor, it also moves the sphere around. So doing that, we're going to use gradient textures. What I did here was I added a map range node afterwards, which allows us to drag the values a bit. And I also added a mix node in between the mapping and the gradient, and this is basically just a common tactic that is always used when you want to add noise to a gradient or like a noise texture or anything like that. As you can see here, we're adding noise to the gradient by using a mix node and then plugging in you can either use a noise texture or like a Voronoi texture as the thing that you quote-unquote displace it with. Over here I'm using Voronoi instead of noise because Voronoi has a more circular look. I'm just explaining it to you now so that in the future when you see me do it a bunch, it isn't anything unfamiliar. Then you could add a color ramp node after the gradient texture, and the reason why is because we can switch to constant like I did there, and basically have it so that it's only two values. We're using white and black, which is just 1 and 0, and what that's going to let us do later is basically set it to whatever colors we want. As I'm doing here, I dragged out a mix node, and basically the A is going to be the black values and the B is going to be the white values. So as you can see here, I'm setting the A to like a darker green color and the B to a lighter green color. I actually, when I was doing this tutorial, I kind of messed up the gradient. It's supposed to be the dark one on the bottom and the bright one on the top. So I'll correct that later. So after this, I added another gradient texture, and basically what we want to do here is the same exact thing. This is basically just going to be another one of those cascading sheets that I was telling you guys about. Already we made the first two with the first gradient, and now we're going to make another one with this second gradient here. We're doing the same exact thing by adding noise with the mix node in between the mapping and the gradient texture, and I'm using a Voronoi texture to displace it once again. And you can obviously play around with all of the settings like the scale, the distortion, and all of that too. As you can see here, I dragged out another color ramp node to binarize it to 1 and 0 again, and yeah. So from now I'm just making some micro adjustments, as you can see in the background here, just kind of adjusting a few things and trying to get it to my liking. There's nothing specific that I can tell you guys here other than, you know, just do it to whatever your taste is. You have so many different like adjustable variables, I guess you could say here, and you just want to set them to whatever you want basically. Over here I added another mix node to basically combine the two gradients together, and as you can see it doesn't look correct right now because, as I told you earlier, I kind of messed up the gradients here, and I'm going to show you how to fix it. Alright guys, so as I was saying, we had to fix these gradients, and basically what I did was I changed the texture coordinates from generated to UV, and basically the reason I switched it to UV is because since this is a completely flat plane, when we use UV mapping, everything is going to be very seamless and easy. With generated before, I was having this issue where the gradient was behaving strangely at the bottom of the object, but when I switched it to UV, everything was fine, and the gradient, when I moved it in the X location up and down, it just worked a lot better. But yeah, so as you can see here, I'm just fixing things a bit, and essentially what we're aiming for is we're aiming to have this kind of like tricolor where there's a top, a middle, and a bottom. And as you can see here, I have that tricolor now where it kind of goes from like lighter to darker and then a little bit lighter again as it's at the bottom. And of course, this is completely up to you what you want the colors to be. If you want it to be like lighter on the bottom, you can do that too. It's going to be up to your eye and what you think looks good at the end of the day. With that first part out of the way, now what we want to do is we want to add these bubbles that appear at the top and kind of just stay in place. So what I'm going to do now is add yet another gradient texture, and this time I'm going to be using quadratic sphere instead of linear, because we want to kind of like define an area of this model where we want those circles to be, right? So what we're doing is we're basically creating a mask here and just setting the mask to whatever area we want those circles to be in. As you can see here, I'm dragging this quadratic sphere so that it's at the top of the model, which is where we want it. So as you can see, to actually make the bubbles or circles, I'm adding a Voronoi texture, and it's nothing crazy at all here. I'm just adding a map range to try and clamp it if I want, and I also added a color ramp to binarize everything by switching it to constant. As you can see here, what I'm doing finally is I'm multiplying the quadratic sphere gradient and the bubbles together so that we have the bubbles only in that sphere area. What I'm also doing here is I'm just adding some displacement to both the bubbles themselves and the gradient texture so that we can have some noise to it, and so that the gradient texture isn't so circular and it's a bit more like messed up, and so that the bubbles aren't also so circular, they're a bit more messed up like that. As you can see here, they have more character now. Anyways, let's continue forward. Basically, I used another color ramp after this to binarize it once again, and from there we can drag out a mix node and pretty much just add in that final color for the bubbles. After that, what I wanted to do was add this sort of, I guess like lines you could say, that kind of go across the waterfall. They kind of like go up and down and they just kind of like slide as if it's falling down the waterfall. So I added a wave texture here, which the reason why is the wave texture gives us these sort of ribbons that are exactly what I want to make for this sort of falling stripes pattern. What I'm also doing here is I'm adding another wave texture, and this might be a little more complicated, but basically what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to have it so that we can break up those previous stripes that we made so that they're only in cycles, I guess you could say. They're only in iterations. So you're about to see what I do here actually. We made this other wave texture to be something where it's horizontal and it only selects for like certain horizontal patches of the model. And so within those white areas that you're seeing right now, within those white areas, we're going to have the previous stripes that we made. So that it's only in like those white areas rather than being in just like the whole model going up and down. So you're about to see what I do. Sorry if that's a little bit unclear, but once I multiply it together, you're going to see exactly what I meant. I should also mention I added another noise texture, which was to basically break up the horizontal stripes that we had. As you can see here, it's not completely visible, but you can see there's a little bit of distortion there that I added. And when we binarize it, it's going to make a lot more sense why I did that. And so yeah, as you can see here, it is a little bit more messed up than what it was before. Of course, we could have also added a mix between the mapping and the wave, but for some reason I decided not to here. So over here, I'm showing you now what I was talking about. If we multiply these two things together, we then get the stripes only in those horizontal parts. And that's what we want, because we want these stripes to be falling down. So if I plug that into another mix node and use the hue saturation value, what we can do is then raise the value on the hue saturation value, and then basically, as you can see now, we have these brighter areas that come from the stripes. So yeah, you could also play with the distortion on the wave texture, but that's up to you. Alright guys, so the next thing we want to do is we want to add the sort of constant dark stripes that appear on this model. Basically, it's just something that I saw that was used in the Spirited Away water, and I'm just trying to like kind of incorporate that into my work here. So basically, I added another wave texture, and what I'm doing here is extremely simple. If you've done the rest of the stuff that we just did in this video, this is nothing complicated at all. Just adding a map range after the wave so that we could clamp things a little bit, and adding a color ramp as well so that we could binarize things. And yeah, so now as you can see, we have 1 and 0 in those little areas that we want to have the stripes, and white everywhere else. So as you can see now, if we just plug that into the mix node, we could use the hue saturation value in the B slot, which is the other areas on the model. And oh, actually I messed up here. I think I meant to plug the hue saturation value into the A slot, so you'll see me correct that in a second. So yeah, as you can see here, everything became like dark, and that's not what we want. So actually another easy way of fixing that is just to flip the values on the color ramp. As you can see here, that's what I did, and now we could easily just adjust it, and we have those sort of dark stripes. After that, what I want to do is I want to add a sort of white foamy thing that appears at the top. So as you can see here, what I'm doing is I added a quadratic sphere, and the logic behind that was basically I wanted to have this sphere at the top of the model, and we're going to distort it a lot so that we can then make it seem like there's some sort of foam that's appearing at the top of the waterfall. So as you can see here, I have a quadratic sphere that I added a color ramp to, and also I added the mix again because we're going to displace the coordinates a bit to make it more noisy. So I switched the coordinates to UV again so that things will work seamlessly. And yeah, as you can see now, we have this big circle that we have to move into place. And so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm once again adding some noise to the gradient. For some reason I accidentally added 2 mix nodes in between the gradient texture and the mapping nodes, so you're going to see me just delete the other one right here. And so yeah, now we have a nice jumbled up sphere at the top, which we've now turned into stripes that look like foam at the top. And so that's something that we're going to be able to animate later. So over here I'm dragging out another mix node, and pretty much what we're doing here is we're just setting those values in the mask to be white on the final composite. So yeah, this is coming together nicely. Obviously there's going to be a lot of color correction that we have to do later on and a lot of animating, but for now this is pretty decent. We just have to keep on adding more things. One other thing I want to add is I want to add a sort of highlight that goes at the top of the waterfall, and this is going to be something that isn't really toon shaded, but once again we're going to use a quadratic sphere, and we want to position this in the top part of the model because we want that area to be a little bit of like highlighted, I guess you could say. And you're going to see pretty soon what I mean by that once we add it to the rest of the nodes. So I'm using a quadratic sphere and just trying to flatten it a bit and getting it into place. And yeah, so I added a map range after that, and I used the step linear option, which lets you have it as like this kind of toon shaded thing with the steps function at the bottom. Obviously I increased it to like a high number of steps, so as you can see it's very almost linear looking, I'd say. One thing I realized before, guys, is that I kind of messed up on the bubbles here. I accidentally had it black to white when it was supposed to be white to black in the color ramp. As you can see, I inverted the color ramp there, and now we have the bubbles as the white values, which is what I wanted originally, because those white values are the ones that actually take the color of whatever we decided. Over here what I did was I added a subdivision surface modifier to the plane. And the reason why is because I want to displace it and actually give it like the waterfall effect, if that makes sense. So I added a displace modifier which lets you displace things, and pretty much I switched it to object coordinates and added an empty, which we're going to use to drive the texture that we use for the displace modifier. Pretty much what we want to happen is when we move that empty, we want the texture to sort of like distort a bit, as if it's like moving in water. As you can see here, I added an image texture and switched it to clouds, and I also scaled out the empty in X so that everything is more like horizontal in the displacement. Over here what I did too was I started duplicating around these waterfall planes a bit. I added 4 of them, and pretty much that's gonna set the stage for the rest of the waterfall scene, I guess you could say, to be added. So as you can see, I'm adding a plane here, which is going to be where the water falls into, and we're going to do like another sort of like animation for this bottom plane here. And yeah, so just move that into place. What I did here was I hit slash to go into local view, and now what we're going to do is we're going to do the shader for the bottom plane. So now to start things off, we're going to add a principal BSDF node. The reason why is because we wanted to have a sort of like reflection property, and the only way to actually get that is to use like an actual shader, as far as I know. So that's why I added it here. But we're going to keep that as the last node in the chain. What we want to do is we want to add a gradient texture, and the purpose of this is going to be so that we could once again have those sort of cascading colors that we had on the waterfall. But this time we're going to be doing it for the bottom plane. So it's the same exact process, and if you guys did it before, I'm sure you'll find it very easy now. The point is to just position the gradient into place. You can add your noise texture in between to give it the distortion and continue on from there. What I wanted to do now is I wanted to add an RGB node, and this is going to be the base color for the plane. Now I didn't really have to do this. I could have just used a mix node and set the colors for the black and the white areas, but for some reason in the final version of this I ended up using an RGB node as the first node in the chain, and then I multiplied by this mask that we created. So as you can see here, I'm dragging out a mix node, which we're going to set to multiply, and what I did was I multiplied it by this black and white mask that we made, and I kept the FAC at something like 0.5 or around that. That was my approach for that. Moving on, I'm going to add another gradient texture, and the point of this is going to be just yet another one of those cascading color gradients that we always make. And so yeah, nothing complicated here. I've already done it like, I think at this point like 4 or 5 other times in this video, so it's nothing new. Just position your gradient into place, position it as you like, and add the noise and the color ramp, and you'll be good to go. So yeah, not much to say here, just doing the usual, and in the end you want to add another mix node, and we're just going to connect it to the rest of the nodes. You can set your color to whatever you want. I used a darker value here because if you think about it, this area in the front, or at the top I guess you could say, it's sort of going to be under the foam, and so we want to kind of have it like pretend that it's sort of casting a shadow over there, which is why I set this final color cascade gradient to be a darker color. The next thing I want to do, adding a noise texture, is going to be this sort of just kind of like specks or like dust, I guess you could say. So the purpose of this noise texture was basically to add some sort of like just sort of specks or dust, I guess, to the model, and as you're gonna see here, I made it to be like these very small, just sort of like distorted spots that appear throughout the plane. And so that was my goal. And so that's why I set it up to look this way. I also multiplied it by like a quadratic sphere gradient that I made, and this was like unnecessary, to be honest. I think the reason I had it there was because before originally I wanted to make it so that it was like the spots were like only in the center of this plane. But ultimately I had them everywhere, so it was just an unnecessary step. You guys don't have to add that in your model. You don't have to add like the second quadratic sphere gradient texture that I multiplied by there. But yeah, so that's just why I did that, in case you're wondering. So yeah, anyways, after that, you add a mix node once again. As you can see, the process is exactly the same. Just set the color to whatever you want, and yeah, that part is concluded. So what we want to do now is we want to add the actual foam that's going to kind of like spread from the top of this plane to the bottom, or like from the left or the right, I guess you could say. Basically, it's going to be going along the y-axis. So I dragged that to a mix node, and I hit Control G to put it into a group. And the reason why I did this will be explained a little later, but for now, if you guys don't know how groups work, there's an input and an output, and basically when you have anything that's in a group, it's kind of like a reusable component of nodes that you can duplicate around and put anywhere. So there's an input and an output, as you can see, and what I did was I deleted all of these other inputs that we didn't need there, because all we want is just a color input and then a color output. If that doesn't make sense, I think as you do the rest of the tutorial, it'll make a lot more sense, because now we're going to actually add the foam, and you'll see why I did that. Basically, to add foam, if you add a Voronoi texture, hit Control T to get its coordinates, and then add yet another Voronoi texture that's connected to the same mapping. We can use the subtract node after that, and basically just subtract the top from the bottom to get these sort of cells that appear. And make sure you set the bottom Voronoi texture to smooth F1, and keep the top one as F1 in the drop-down menu. Over there, I shift right-clicked to create an intersection point, and what I'm doing here is I'm just adding noise once again. Obviously, we had to add the intersection there because since it was splitting out into two different nodes, and we wanted to have something in between that, we needed an intersection point. And so yeah, as you can see now, it has this very painterly look. And what we're going to want to do is add a map range after that, so that we can actually clamp things as we want, according to our taste. Okay, so I'm basically adding a gradient texture here and using quadratic sphere. The point of it is basically we only want this foam to basically appear in the part where the, I guess, like waterfall is reaching the floor, I guess you could say. So as you can see, I'm positioning the quadratic sphere so that it is basically in that area. And of course, you can add a map range as well if you want to clamp things. That's up to you. You probably should add it so that you can adjust things on the fly. And we just want to multiply the foam and this sphere together, and what we get from there is our final mask. And I adjusted the scale as well of the foam to make it a bit more scaled in. And yeah, from there you can just add a color ramp to binarize everything, and from there it becomes a mask which you can use as your foam. So just plug that into the FAC, and then for the B you can set it to white. And as you can see now, if we shift click on the group, we have our foam combined with everything else, which is pretty cool. So now what I want to do is I want to add an overall gradient that goes from basically the place where the water falls in the waterfall to the part of the plane that's closest to us, if that makes any sense. You're going to see here what I do though. Basically we have a gradient texture that we use again, and the reason I added the hue saturation value node in advance at the top there is because basically one of them is going to be for the darker part of the gradient and one of them is going to be for the lighter part, so we could easily adjust their values. But anyways, as you can see here, we have the gradient texture and I'm just moving it into place. You basically just wanted to go from one edge to the other edge, and yeah, you could add some noise as well like I did here. And yeah, so it's a pretty simple setup. As you can see, I added a map range after the gradient texture here. And basically since we plug that into the FAC, we can just adjust these value parameters. And basically the way it works is, remember that the A is the dark parts of the gradient and the B is the bright parts of the gradient. So if we increase the value going into the A slot, that means the dark areas of the gradient will become brighter, and vice versa with the B slot. It would be the white values getting more affected. Okay, so now going out of local view, what I want to do is I want to add a path curve, and what this is going to be is it's going to be the actual physical foam object that we add. So if you go into the bevel section in the curve tab, you can basically just raise the depth value and make it thicker. You can also make it thicker by hitting tab to go into edit mode on the curve and hitting Alt S and scaling it like that. And yeah, so basically you just want to kind of position this curve into place just at the intersection point between the waterfall objects and the bottom plane, and eventually you want to hit object and convert to mesh. As you can see, I undid it a few times here because I wanted to see what the density would be at different resolutions, but ultimately I decided on 12 as a good resolution value, and then I converted it to a mesh. Now what you want to do here is you want to basically just move up and down at certain points on the foam object. The reason why is because if you look at the foam objects in Spirited Away, for example, the foam kind of has this I guess you could say, waviness to it, where there's parts that are higher and parts that are lower. So we just want to simulate that here, and that's why I basically just moved around the vertices so that some of them were up and some of them were down more. What I did after that was I added a displace modifier to the foam, and I added an empty that I renamed to foam displace, and what we're doing is we're using this empty to drive the coordinates of the texture that we're using for the displace modifier. I once again switched the texture to clouds, and I played around with the strength a bit, and now basically when you move the foam displace empty up and down, it'll give this sort of like jittering effect that we want to have for the foam object. So I added a subdivision after that to smooth it out a bit, and then I added yet another displace after that, the purpose of which is basically to add a more refined displacement to the model. One issue we run into though is you can't edit two textures at the same time on one object. So as you can see, this object, this foam object, it's using two displace modifiers, and one displace modifier has texture.001 and the other displace modifier has texture.002. So the issue with this is you can only really edit one texture at a time on a single object. So what I'm doing is I added a cube, and basically if you go to the texture tab, you can basically just use this cube as a placeholder and select whatever texture you want to edit and just edit it on the cube, and it'll update on the foam model. So yeah guys, for this more refined texture, this texture.002, I ended up using the wood type instead of clouds, and I edited some of the settings there as you saw. I switched the type to saw, and I changed with the size and the turbulence of it. So just from experimenting a bit, I found that wood worked well for like a secondary displacement, so that's why I used it. So what I'm doing here now is I added a gradient texture, which we're going to use for the shading for the foam pretty much. As usual, I'm adding some distortion to it as well, but yeah, nothing complicated about it at all here. I'm just going to set the colors so that the top is a white color and the bottom is a more bluish, darker color. And yeah, so that's how I made the shading for the foam pretty much. If you want, you could also add a sun object and add a diffuse BSDF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp, which is just a basic toon shader setup, and switch it from linear to constant, and kind of add that to the gradient that we made before. So if we combine those two together, using an add node, we can have it so that it both uses the toon shaded diffuse BSDF from the sunlight and the gradient that we added in manually. Make sure you check the clamp result option though, so that the values don't go over 1 when you add them together. But yeah, after that you can add a mix node and set the colors to whatever you like. So the next thing I want to do is add a wave texture to the waterfall objects, and what we're going to do here is I wanted to add some sort of foam that kind of falls on the waterfall, if that makes sense, and it just like falls down. And you're going to see here why I added the group to the foam on the bottom before. The reason why is because basically we're going to be reusing that here. So basically for the wave textures here, the point is I'm trying to make them so that we have these sort of bands that inside of these wave texture bands is going to be that foam that we made on the bottom. And if you add the foam group, you can then see it's really messed up. It's easy to fix though if you just click the 2 button to make it its own, and then we get rid of the multiply from the quadratic sphere and we change the scaling a bit, everything will be good to go. And so yeah, after that you can combine the 2 with a multiply node, and then inside of those areas of the wave texture are going to be the foam objects that we made before. Sorry, the foam shader or whatever. And yeah, so at the end there, you can just combine it with a white in the mix node as the B value. And yeah, from there, we're just going to be making micro adjustments to kind of get it to the way that we want it to look. So now what I want to do is I want to add some sort of, I guess you could say like foam bubbles that come up from the foam, and just like across the model in general there's going to be like this foam. And so what I did was I added an icosphere and I set its material to just like a completely flat white RGB color. And what you want to do is you want to add a plane and add a new particle system and basically set the settings to start at -50 and end at frame 250, which is when the animation ends. And pretty much you can adjust the velocity and all of those factors as well. And what it's going to do is it's basically going to send these icospheres that we made up, and so it's going to be as if the foam is kind of like, I guess you could say, just like going everywhere. It's kind of like flashing everywhere, and so you can just position that plane into place, and when you hit play it'll start automatically. Also for the plane, it's a good idea to set its material to a transparent BSDF so that you don't see the plane object itself and you only see the icospheres. And so the reason why I set the frame start to be -50 is because when we start playing the animation, we want it to already be splashing. If we made it start at 0, then what would have happened was that it would have just started to like flash out at frame 0, whereas we want it to already be in progress of just going everywhere. Before we go any further, I just want to kind of brief you guys on how we're going to do the animating. So it's very simple. What we're going to be doing is basically you're going to hit the insert single keyframe button on the mapping nodes and move forward in the timeline after you insert one keyframe. then you change the Z value or whatever value you're animating again, then insert another keyframe. And then basically from there, what you want to do is you want to select all the keyframes. And then basically from there, what you want to do with the mapping node selected, obviously, is select those 2 keyframes that you just made, hit T, and then hit linear interpolation. What that does is, you can't really see it here, but it changes it from being Bezier interpolation to linear interpolation, which means there's no ease in or ease out. After that, what you want to do is you want to hit Shift D with those 2 keyframes selected and hit Shift D linear extrapolation, and what that's going to do is it's going to make that animation continuously play forever. So even though we, inserted the final keyframe around like frame 50, it's going to keep on going forever after that, the animation now. So yeah, that's basically going to be the process for how we were going to animate stuff. What I'm going to do now is I want to start to actually animate everything. So basically what I did was I dragged out the timeline and I collapsed the shader editor, and I basically made the shader editor go to the right side of the screen and split things up a bit in the viewport so that things would be a little bit easier to see now, as you can see. And what we want to do is we just want to keyframe a lot of these mapping nodes that we have across our shader, and basically just by simply animating those mapping nodes, it's going to be really easy and we can make animation that way. So what I'm doing is I'm right clicking on the Z axis for these cascading ones, hitting insert single keyframe, and then moving forward in the timeline a bit, and then changing the value of the Z location, and then inserting the keyframe again. After that, I hit T on the timeline, set it to linear interpolation, and then hit Shift D, set it to linear extrapolation. What all that does is it basically just makes it so that it animates between those 2 keyframes at a constant rate because we set it to linear interpolation, but it also keeps on going forever because we set it to linear extrapolation. So yeah, as you can see, I'm just keyframing a lot of these mapping nodes here. For the stripes, I keyframe the X location because we want it to be going from the top to the bottom and we want it to be moving down like that. Normally I'll do the Z because the Z, it doesn't actually move the gradient in any direction, it just kind of like makes it animate in place, if that makes sense. And so yeah, the process is the exact same thing for all of these. It's nothing complicated at all. You just want to animate, you can animate whatever you want, to be honest. That's the thing about this, is you don't have to do the things that I'm doing exactly, but rather like each and every single one of these values is animatable. So there's a lot of cool different things that you could do if you wanted to. As you can see here, I'm animating the bottom foam as well. Nothing new here. Just remember, for the foam, you want it to be spreading away from wherever the waterfall is. Over here, I'm animating the water object as well. We added the displace before, but I forgot to actually animate it, so that's what I'm doing now. I'm also increasing the strength of the displace on each of the objects so that it's a little bit more noticeable now. So the next thing I want to do now is actually keyframe the displacement for the foam. So as you can see here, what I'm doing, it's similar to everything else we've animated. Literally just keyframing one point where it's up, then I move it down a bit, and then I keyframe it again. And I hit T for linear interpolation and Shift T for linear extrapolation. And now what I'm doing here is I'm just duplicating around the foam bubble objects that we made. And basically you can just duplicate these around wherever you want. I put them at the top and the bottom. And you'll see later I also put them at like the sides. And so yeah, you have complete freedom to put them wherever you want. Also, for those of you who are more serious about learning and really want to become good at this style, I recommend checking out ukiyogirls.io if you want in-depth step-by-step tutorials. I'll show you the exact process for making this anime portrait from scratch, as well as a rigged full body character including texturing the body and just everything else. I'll also show you the full process for making this koi pond model in animation, as well as the sunflower one. You'll learn about sculpting the body, texturing, and making effective shaders that give off that wow factor, even if you have no prior experience. You'll also learn about my layered method, which is basically the process I've developed over years of trial and error to basically guarantee that my works look good through observation, as observation is a skill constantly overlooked, but yet it's so critically important in making good looking models. Not only that, but you'll be given access to our Discord community, where you can ask me whatever you want about art, and you'll also be given access to both my add-ons that I've developed and are normally paid. The next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to add a final hue saturation value to the end of the nodes, because I wanted it to be a more blue color, if that makes sense. Because before it was green, and while this looks decent, I think that blue, for the sake of this, for what I was trying to make, it just looked better. So I shifted the hue and the saturation around a bit, as you can see here, and I changed the value as well in the end. And so yeah, from here on out, it's really just like a lot of adjusting things. All of the water shaders are done already, and you know, you just have to, at this point, use your judgment and switch colors around and maybe change the shape of some things. And yeah. Alright guys, so I did forget to animate the bubbles on the waterfall object, so as you can see, I'm just doing that here now. And yeah, the process once again is exactly the same, and now we have everything moving pretty nicely. I also mentioned before that I accidentally messed up the scaling on the top cascade in the waterfall, so as you can see there, I just deleted the keyframes on the scale and moved it to the location, which is what I meant to do originally, but accidentally I made a mistake and I keyframed the scale in Z instead of the location in Z. One thing I want to say is remember to enable screen space refraction so that when you plug it into the base color here in the principled BSDF, in the end you can see the reflection that appears. And that'll only work if you enable screen space refraction, so make sure you do that. So yeah, you can animate the foam going down as well, I recommend you do that, and yeah. That was pretty much the last piece of the shader that we needed for the waterfall. One last thing I wanted to add to the bottom plane was another kind of reflective looking noise texture. So as you can see, I'm just adding that here. It's nothing complicated. Very similar to all the things we've done before. I'm just using a map range to clamp some of the values, and you'll see pretty soon what it actually looks like in the end. I used the trick once again of using a quadratic sphere to multiply it and constrict it to only a certain area. For this noise texture, I wanted to only be in the center, so that's why I added that here. And so then I was able to make it so that it wasn't on the sides and it was only in the center of the plane. So one final thing I want to do is I want to add the rocks, and so basically all you have to do is add an icosphere, and from there what we can do is add a subdivision surface modifier and a displace modifier. What this is going to do is we're basically just going to displace the icosphere that we added, and from there it's automatically going to start to look like a rock shape. So here I added a clouds texture again. So for the shader for it, we're just going to add a Voronoi texture, and it's going to be pretty simple. We're just going to have like a sort of blue, dark blue color that has these cracks in it, and to make the cracks we're using the Voronoi texture. So what I did was I added a noise texture, and basically I added that to the Voronoi. The reason why was basically because the point is basically going to be to kind of like diversify the cracks a little bit so that they're not just all continuous. And I also added a power node, which allows you to kind of clamp the values a little bit better. It's similar to map range, but what power does is it's more, I guess you could say, heavy on the dark areas of the texture. And I also added a tune shader for just establishing the base colors, which is going to be blue and like a darker blue color. And so yeah, I actually messed up the Voronoi texture a bit, so you're going to see now how I fix it. Basically, I meant to use distance to edge instead of F1 as the option for the Voronoi texture, and now, as you're going to see, everything will be fixed. Because using distance to edge gives us these sort of cracks that look like rocks, and that's going to really help us to sell the effect. So as you can see there, I just used the mask and put like a sort of light blue color in the crack areas, and the rest is just the base color. You could also use a dark color for the cracks, but I thought for some reason like using a light color worked here, so that's why I did that. From there, you can just duplicate the rocks around and just rotate them a bit so it looks a little bit varied. You might have to apply the transforms and set the origin to geometry so that things properly scale, because before it wasn't scaling properly. But yeah, this is just a repetitive process of duplicating everything around. Over here what I'm doing is I'm basically making the material unique for each and every waterfall object that we had by clicking on the number button in the material slot. What this does is, as you guys probably already know, it'll make it its own material, so now we can add a unique custom variation to each one. As we have 4, and like as it was before, they were doing the same exact thing. But here what I'm doing is I'm adding some more variation by basically just adjusting the mapping nodes a little bit on each and every single one of the waterfall objects so that it's not all the exact same thing. You can also move around the keyframes that you had, so that basically on certain waterfall objects it'll be at a different point in time for the animation, thus making them unique and not like the exact same thing all 4 times. Over here I just added some more bubble particle planes, and I scaled them out a bit as I was telling you guys before that I would do. And so yeah, you can position them like along the edges of the rocks as well, that's what I was doing here, and also around the foam objects. One more thing we should do is we should add a camera, and then after you add the camera, if you hit Ctrl Alt numpad 0, you can basically make it so that the camera goes to whatever you're looking at currently. And from there, what I like to do is I like to enable depth of field in the camera option settings, and I add an empty. I rename that empty focus, and then what I do is I set the depth of field object to be that focus empty, so that now when we move around the focus empty, it'll change like where the camera focuses pretty much. So in the end, after making some more micro adjustments, this is what it looked like for me. Honestly, making small adjustments in the end is something that can take a while, as you're kind of just testing different little changes out until you have something nice. But yeah, there wasn't really much for me to record there, and I gave you guys the file as well, so you can check my exact values on that file. With that said, I hope you guys learned a lot, and if you want to learn more, you can check out the rest of the videos on my channel. Ciao!